probably no matter where you are on the spectrum of being someone who has grown up in a tradition where you have felt like you had to work hard for your acceptance, or if you have been swimming in waters of grace for a really long time, I think we would all do well to be reminded that there is a divine well from which you can draw, and that you are seen and held there, and that there's nothing that you can do to make God love you more or less. And for me, when I engage in any practice, whether it's silence and solitude, something more formal like that, and I say formal in the sense of more traditional practice, or if it's an unconventional practice like making dinner or going for a walk, no matter which of those practices I engage, the point is, am I entering into this practice with an awareness that God is with me?
Hey friends, welcome to the Holy Shift Show. I'm your host, Christine Crawford, and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast is for anyone willing to be curious, dig deep, and be surprised by God. Well, welcome to the third episode of our Draw Near, Dwell Well series, where we're learning how to overcome overwhelm and live more healed and whole. To do that, we're going to be exploring soul care and spiritual formation practices that help us connect deeply with God, ourselves, and others. Now, if you're just now joining us, I highly recommend that you go back and catch the first two episodes. It's where I kind of explain the season's theme and provide some context as to why I chose it. I also share some of the personal and spiritual holy shifts that I've been navigating, including muddling through a prolonged season of grief and loss and trying to heal from the physical and emotional impact of a painful marriage and an unwanted divorce. And in this season of grief and growth, I have been learning so much about myself, God, and what love really looks like. I have been experiencing some seismic level holy shifts in each of those areas. So this season is all about sharing some scriptural truths, the spiritual practices, and helpful resources that have been guiding me along the way in hopes that you might find them encouraging and helpful too. So I'm going to be sharing the ways that God has comforted me in this valley and the soul care and spiritual formation practices that have been helping me learn how to live healed and whole, because I'm betting that I'm not the only one who wants to learn how to do that. And sadly, I know I'm not the only one grieving tremendous loss, betrayal, abandonment, disappointment, even disillusionment. I know so many of you feel worn out and hemmed in, overwhelmed. Your schedules are hectic, your emotions are chaotic, and you're probably longing for a quieter life, a closer relationship with God, maybe greater health in your relationships with others. If any of that resonates at all, this season is for you. I want to invite you to join me on my journey in learning how to draw near to and dwell well with God. So today, we're going to start learning from the experts in this area. And I knew that the very best person to help us kick this off was Emily P. Freeman. Emily is a best-selling author, a podcaster, and a spiritual director. And her entire body of work centers on how to help us discern when and how to make hard choices and decisions. She helps us get over analysis paralysis and decision fatigue, and I love her for it. So I knew she'd be perfect to help us begin to be curious about next and necessary holy shifts we might need to make in our lives and faith. So she's going to help us explore how the rooms we live in and the rhythms that we live by help shape the people we're becoming and guide us in discerning which rooms, rhythms, rituals, and relationships help us draw near to and dwell well with God. I think we might discover, especially as women in the Western church and world, that we may have been misunderstanding the purpose, the premise, and the path of faith. And as this entire ministry contends, we may have had some things upside down all along. So as we're exploring some new spiritual practices and trying to think where we might need to make holy shifts, I knew that she would be a wonderful guide in helping us begin. So let's get started. Join us as we discuss drawing near and dwelling well, and explore the upside down kingdom of God as the right way forward in faith and life. Emily, I am so excited and so grateful to have you here with us today. I could not think of anybody better in the whole wide world to talk to us about discernment and deciding how and when to make huge holy shifts in our life. And the reason I wanted you to be the person to come on is because you're not only an author and a podcaster, you also are a spiritual director And so you come to us with a ton of wisdom in the area of discernment. In fact, almost all of your work centers around helping us discern how to make really challenging decisions in our lives. But I also just finished reading your latest book. And I know that you have been walking this and navigating this yourself. You've been making some really big holy shifts in your own life and your own faith. And so, first of all, I just want to say I'm so grateful that you're willing to come on here and kind of share all of that. I know some of it's tender and some of it's hard, but you come with the street cred now. And I love that because I think, we like to learn from an expert, but I think the real experts are the people who have walked it. And you're both. So thank you for coming on here to kind of share your heart and your wisdom with us on this.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here with you, Christine. And also, can I just say, the title of your podcast is so brilliant. And I ever since I got the invitation to be on here, I haven't stopped thinking about like the holy shift. It's so good. Well done, my dear. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a whole argument with Jesus on whether or not I should call it that because I was afraid, the Baptists will never let me in if they understand the pun. But it's been great. It kind of helps people understand that most of the work I'm going to do is going to be a little bit tongue in cheek. So as we're diving in, I think the first thing that I'd like to ask you is if you would share a little bit about some of the holy shifts that you've been navigating, especially in the realm of like overcoming overwhelm and connecting with God, with yourself, with people around you. Can you share a little bit about what you've been learning?
Well, when you ask that question, the first thing that comes to my mind is a time in my life about a little over 10 years ago now when I was maybe in the middle of launching my second or third book. I can't remember which one. And it was things were kind of picking up in my own life as far as the kids were in school now. And I was starting to travel a little bit more and was being invited to speak at different places. As an author, sometimes you get invited to go places. So life was starting to take off, if you will, as far as my schedule. And I was at a particular retreat, and I was one of the leaders of the retreat. It was a Renovare retreat for their leaders. I was, a part of the leadership team there just for the retreat weekend. But I've noticed in myself like a shift happening, and it was not a welcome one. It was, I felt overwhelmed. I felt tired. I desperately wanted to be really present in the room, and I was to the best of my own ability at the time. But I remember having a conversation with one of the co-leaders of the weekend, who also happened to be a spiritual director. And I shared with him a little bit. He's a longtime family friend. I shared with him a little bit about how I was feeling and how I thought maybe possibly a spiritual director could be someone who could companion me through some of my own exhaustion, but also like my spiritual curiosity that was starting to emerge. Because as I'm sure you know, and probably everyone listening knows, if you grew up in the church or in a faith space, that, probably you didn't get it all right when you were 10. Probably as you grow and as you learn things and as you encounter God in new and different ways, things are going to begin to shift around you and within you. And some of that was starting to happen for me about a decade ago. And so he recommended a spiritual director. And at the time, I didn't really even know. I knew what they did ish, but I'd never seen a spiritual director. And in fact, maybe I would have thought that was a little bit woo-woo. But I was desperate enough to try it out. So I sent the email to this woman who lived locally in my town. And I just kind of told her what I told you just now. And she wrote back and she said, spiritual direction is where one person holds prayerful space on behalf of someone else. And she sort of described a little bit more and said, why don't you come and we'll just explore what God might have for us in that time. And it's a non-agended space. It's boundaried in that it's safe in there. And she's going to kind of make sure I don't fall off any cliffs, if you will, like, inside myself or anything like that. But I was nervous going in. But I feel like that time in my life, going to see her, trusting that unknown space, being curious about what God might be up to within me and around me in a practice that I did not grow up with. Spiritual direction is not a practice I grew up with. If you grew up in the Catholic tradition, you might be more familiar with it. But I would say that's one that I can remember as being a big holy shift, because for me, what began to happen was it wasn't so much about what I needed to learn Instead, it was more about some things I needed to unlearn.
Mm.
And I didn't leave her, warm sunroom with all these things I needed to do,
Mm-hmm.
but I was aware of some things that needed to be undone within me. And I think that was the beginning of a posture of curiosity and of kind of a slow opening of my hand to God.
What would you say you were seeking in doing that? Was it like just more balance, like more wholeness, more connection? Like you mentioned you were really wanting to be present when this shift started, to, reveal itself. What do you think you were seeking in starting that step and bringing in a spiritual director and letting yourself be really curious?
I think a lot of times when we find ourselves trying something new or different, we're not even sure what it is we're seeking.
Mhm,
We just know maybe we're looking for something more or
mhm,
something different.
mm,
I wrote books from a faith-based perspective. So here I was, someone who deeply valued my relationship with people, with God, but also was finding it difficult to engage.
mm,
I started to notice in myself a need to be alone, but maybe not in a generative way, almost
mhm.
like leave me alone,
Okay.
more than a like finding, some peace and solitude. I was a little bit agitated because I think my schedule was really full and
Mhm,
I was learning how to kind of balance the action and inaction of a healthy life and
mhm,
what that looks like. And I'll also say at that particular time, so my husband had been a pastor, youth pastor for 12 years at two different churches and had just recently left our church. Not for anything bad, it's just he was having kind of a vocational shift as far
mhm,
as no longer working as a pastor formally on staff. So we left that church and it was maybe 6 months later is this time I was talking about, and so I think there was some loneliness that I was starting to become aware of, and I wasn't sure what to do with it.
uh-huh,
I wasn't sure how to process my own, discomfort with the grief of leaving a community, and also whenever you leave a any type of community, really, but I'll say because I'm talking about a church, at that time 10 years ago when we left that particular church because of a job, I mean, that was really the reason, it was a
mhm,
different job. There's an interesting experience that can happen in us because we start to evaluate the relationships we had in that community. And now when we left, we stayed in the same town,
mm,
but those relationships had changed. And so
mhm,
there was questioning for me about were they authentic or
mm,
well, now that I don't go to that church anymore, where do I actually belong? So there's
mm,
questions of belonging and identity and
mhm,
authenticity that can come up. And so I think a lot of that was kind of swirling in me. Now, would I have said it that way at the time? Probably not.
mhm,
But upon reflection,
mhm,
I think there was just some disruption happening in my life, but it wasn't clinical. So it wasn't like
mhm.
I need to see a psychologist, although that could always help, I'm sure. And it wasn't necessarily strictly, there wasn't I wasn't looking for a transaction. I
Okay.
think I was looking for care and for space, and that maybe was the difference.
Mhm. Wow, yeah, that resonates. And I'm thinking, like, care and space, like, so the purpose of this season that I'm doing, this series, this Draw Near and Dwell Well, is because my faith background and a lot of the people that I'm in community with, our faith background is one of adding more knowledge instead of creating more presence or experiencing more presence. And as I've been navigating these massive holy shifts in my own life, I'm finding it's not the knowledge that comforts. It's the presence that does. And sometimes we need to make space for presence. Sometimes we need to shift some things in our lives and schedules so that we can actually dwell with God, hear from God, and experience like His love and His tenderness. So when I'm thinking about the spiritual practices and the soul care, like the spiritual formation and the soul care practices that I'm introducing or reintroducing to a lot of people through this series, I'm wondering, actually, just to be really honest, I'm thinking back at the ways that I have gotten my understanding of spiritual formation and soul care upside down. So I wondered if you could tell us how you think some of us might be misunderstanding God or getting spiritual formation and soul care upside down.
This is such an excellent and relevant question. And I'll just say, as a side note, so I teach twice a year out in Wichita in a Master's of Christian Spiritual Formation and Leadership program.
Okay.
And so I help to lead the residencies. And so what that means is there's about 30 to 35 students who are in the room. We're talking about soul care, spiritual formation. I mean, they're getting their master's degree in spiritual formation, which is the same degree that I got.
Mm-hmm.
And usually the students are already doing the work of pastoring or leading or teaching of some kind. But this is a question. The answer to this question is something I think they're all asking. And I think a lot of us have gotten this upside down. And so I say that just kind of as a segue into the answer that I think how we've gotten it upside down is I think that the danger is we make the practice the point rather than union with and connection with God.
Yes.
And I also think we make the mistake of starting with the practice rather than the person. That because the practices that we choose to engage are informed by the person who we are becoming. And so if we try to begin with, okay, I'm going to be spiritually formed and I'm going to engage in these practices that they say I ought to do in order to whatever, be known by God, know more about God, and you begin to engage those. On the one hand, there's nothing wrong with that. What a beautiful intention to engage practice to draw near to God. But I think when we start with the practice rather than with an understanding of who I am in God, of what my own spiritual personality is, of what matters most to me as a person who is made in God's image and through whom God expresses God's self through the unique filter of my personality that's going to look different than the way God's expressed through your personality, those things are going to inform the practices that we choose to engage.
Yeah.
And the practices are just not the point. And that if we find that a practice keeps us from experiencing God or feels like it gets in the way, then maybe that's not a practice we ought to be engaging right now, because the goal is always going to be union with and connection with God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a first episode that I recorded where I talk about the purpose of the practices, I talk about, look, I'm not trying to give you a new formula to replace the old formula. And that's something that I've experienced in kind of my faith background is we've been given like a formula to follow to get closer to God. And in my experience, it's been kind of like hyper intellectualized, like it all lives up here like we're brains on sticks, instead of a more like experiential, like nearness with God where he can actually begin to transform. And so this isn't some new formula that we want people to follow. This isn't a checklist. The practices are just, if you don't know what else to do, try this. So this draw near, dwell well, I'm sharing some of the ones that were helpful to me because I so badly needed to slow down, to get still. I so badly needed to simplify my life. I so badly needed to give myself permission to rest for the first time, to learn how to embrace silence and solitude. And those are not practices that were being taught in the faith background that I come from, which is what a large amount of my audience is now. So because it's not the practices I think are the answer, it is how I was able to experience God and his love and his tenderness and his mercy in a way that I have not been able to do before. And so I offer these kind of up as like, hey guys, these are some practices that have been helping me. But the point is, are you drawing near? Are you dwelling well? And, what practices help us do that? And the reason, I love all of your work, but the reason I so loved your last book is because you talk about, and I'm going to kind of read this. It's not a direct quote, but I've taken the liberty of summarizing it. You talk about how the rooms we live in and the rhythms we live by shape the people we are becoming. And you also talk about how we can discern which rooms, rituals, relationships, and rhythms are helping us draw near to and dwell well with God. Can you expound upon that a little bit for us?
Well, I think about, the metaphor that I use in the book, but just in my life, when I think about the various decisions that we make, the people that we belong to, the places that we spend our time, it's really our life is like a house and every room holds a story. And some of those rooms that we're in are rooms that maybe we were born into. We feel deeply connected to, and maybe we'll stay in them forever. Other rooms, we just are in and out for a season. Maybe it's a school time that we're in school, or, a commitment that we make. That's maybe a room. And then there are some rooms that we like peek our head in and we're like, yeah, I tried that. Not for me, not going back. I think when it comes to how do the rooms that we're in the rituals that we engage, how do they shape us and to who we are becoming? It's an excellent question. I think it's always happening. We like to think that, the decisions that we make are like, I have complete control over who I am becoming. And it's like the things that I decide determine where I end up. And I guess in some ways that's true. But we also know there's a lot of things that just happen to us. And then our task is to respond. And I think it was Iris Murdoch who said, when the moment of decision comes, most of the business of choosing is already over. And so my work really exists in that space of what do we do when we're off the spot, if you will, in those rooms and spaces and relationships, in those daily decisions of life, the rhythms that we engage, the practices that we intend to engage in. What's happening in us and around us in those times so that when it comes to something that we need to respond to now, like you were in a car accident and it's your fault, or your teenager's asking you a question and it's midnight, they want a response. You don't have time to go look it up in a commentary, pray about it, or ask 10 people their advice. Like you got to respond to the teenager. We are becoming who we're becoming at all those other times, in all those rooms that we're in and the relationships that we have. And so I guess the question that I'm always asking myself is this a room where I still belong? Is this a room that I am contributing to helping to shape the character of the people around me, and that my character is being shaped in a way that's generative? Or is it time for me to move on from this space for a myriad of different reasons? And how can I know? And I think that's part of the discernment process that I think is so important. But I think that idea of who I'm becoming is determined not just by the choices that I'm making, but also by the rooms that I'm in and the people that I'm around. And some of that we have agency in, and some of it we don't. But it all has an impact.
Yes, I wish I would have had this book in my hand when I was having to discern how to make some of the biggest holy shifts I've ever had to make. It would have been very helpful to me for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that I love that you said, and I'm grateful that one of the communities I was in as I was having to decide whether or not I was going to leave my marriage, how that was going to happen. One of the first things that they did was have us sit down and establish what we believe our core values are. And of course, we're deciding our core values, if we're people of faith, according to what we think is in alignment with the heart of God. And then we have to look around the rooms we're in and say, does this look like God? Is this helping me become more like Jesus? Is this helping me love like Jesus? Does this align with his heart and his will for my life? Does this align with the things that I believe are, integral to everything that I hold dear? And when you talk in your book about knowing our core values, and you talk a little bit about arrows and how we can use these arrows and think about who we think God is and who we think we really are to determine if a room is right or safe or good or forever or temporary. That was so helpful to me. That was so, so helpful to me. And I really wish I would have had it back then. But and we've got about 98% women listening. Some of them are dealing with some of the things. I don't want to project all of my issues onto my audience, but as I talk to my community, I'm hearing echoes of some of the same things that I was working against, which is, I call it new Gnosticism. And basically, it's a teaching that has kind of crept into the church that asks people, but especially I think women, to divorce themselves from their bodies, from their emotions, from their needs, from their desires, from even their values, in order to live up to the expectation that maybe their church holds for them, or maybe, that a relationship is asking of them. And I think when we have to exist outside of ourselves, it's really hard to connect with the God who made us. Has that been your experience, or am I an island on this?
You're not an island.
Okay.
And when I hear you talk, I hear echoes of conversations I've had with, like you said, all women. I don't think I've really had this type of conversation with men, not to say that the men aren't also feeling this way. I don't know. But the people I hear from are mainly women. And it's the question of, for me, it comes up when I talk about desire.
Okay.
I get a lot of pushback when I say, not just desire, but also when I encourage people to consider the question, what if you could trust yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And women freak all the way out because we've been told that we are not only can we not trust ourselves, but we're not supposed to, because God says that the heart is desperately wicked and all these, and there's a verse in the Bible, if you pull it out of its context, that those words are there. But the Bible also says that God has made all things new, and I've been given a new heart, and that God dwells within me, and that God holds all things together, that in Christ all things are held together. And so I would challenge that anyone who their experience is, I have to pull myself apart in order to exist in this room. I don't know that I would say run out the door, but I would say that could be a red flag. Pay attention, look around, and ask yourself some questions about this room. If you are looking at a room, and if you ask yourself, to what extent can I be myself in this room? Do I have to change myself to such a degree that I don't even recognize myself in order to inhabit this space, whatever the space is? If people who know and loved me the most were to show up here, what questions would they have for me? Would they see a version of me that they recognize and they're like, oh, there she is. Yeah, that's who I know her to be. Or would they see someone who feels like she has to constantly censor or edit or muffle or make herself smaller or not voice her ideas or her thoughts or her opinions?
Hey friends, so sorry to interrupt this amazing conversation, and I do hope you're enjoying it, but I just wanted to remind you of some fun new resources and opportunities that we have for you at The Holy Shift. For one, I wanted to make it easier than ever to connect. I'm eager to hear from you and to see if and how any of this Draw Near, Dwell Well series resonates. I'd love to know how you're growing and where you're struggling. So I encourage you to reach out to me via our Instagram account, which is at The Holy Shift Ministry, or via our Connect page on the website. This show, after all, is for you, so I want to hear from you. And because what I have been working on has meant so much to me, I've been sharing it with others in more private settings for a while now. That has allowed me to connect more intimately with you guys, and that's what I really love to do. See, I believe that we both grow and heal in community, and it has been incredibly rewarding to witness the relief, joy, and peace drawing near and dwelling well brings. So now I'm offering some of these resources and opportunities publicly, and you can find them under the new resources tab on the website. Now you'll notice several drop-down options there, including a Draw Near, Dwell Well page where you can access a free workbook that you can download for the series. I've put some scripture, quotes, and art in there that might be helpful, as well as some journal prompts and Holy Shift type questions to explore. It's a totally free resource, as well as a rather robust resource list that I've made where you can learn more about each of these topics and practices that we're going to be exploring here on the show. And then I have an entire Draw Near, Dwell Well online course available to you. This is a pre-recorded class that you can access instantly with a link and a password so that you can work through all this material in a slower, more convenient, and applicable way. I also get a lot more personal there, but I will tell you, it's a lot less like a course and more like a conversation. I am far too weary to put on my fancy pants these days. So you're literally going to get me in my garden, on my porch, and in my studio, just sharing the raw and real of what I've been learning. I do have some snazzy slides, an enhanced workbook, and some fun new bonuses in that course as well. And I'm also going to be offering a handful of times where I work through this material in a live small group setting so that we can workshop it together and even do some Q&A. And I'm now offering what I'm calling shift sessions, which are just opportunities for us to chat one-on-one and determine if, how, and when you can begin to make a holy shift in your own life. So if you want to go deeper in your faith, but you're not sure where or how to start, or if you need some help muddling through a question you have or a challenging truth you've learned, I'm here for you. You'll receive personal encouragement and practical guidance, and I'll help you clarify any mistheologies and misunderstandings of God's heart and will for you. And then if you really want to go deep, consider doing some one-on-one spiritual mentoring with me. I'd be honored to walk with you in your spiritual journey and encourage you as you learn how to live healed and whole. And if you want to help others draw near and dwell well, would you consider contributing to the Holy Shift? It helps support this work and enables me to continue to encourage others through this ministry. I operate as a nonprofit in partnership with the Women's Nonprofit Alliance, so all donations are tax deductible, and you can do this under the Contribute tab on the website. Again, all of that is available at theholyshift.org or via the links in the show notes. Okay, now back to our conversation.
As someone made in God's image, I don't think God is ever telling us to not be who we are. I don't believe that there is an invitation of muffling or censoring. Now, quieting and stillness, there's an invitation there that I think is more one of a settling. There's a difference between silence and silencing someone. Like a silence can be a peaceful presence, and then silencing is like you're not allowed to be here. I think it was David Gushee who said, if you want to know the reality of what's happening in a space, ask the people who are at the margins, because it's the ones who are at the margins who have the whole story.
Right.
Whereas sometimes the ones who are in power or in the center, they just see what they see. They don't see from the perspective of the one in the margin. So that's also it can be an informative question.
Yes. And there's a very big difference between going low, right, which Christ teaches, going low and being humble, and having to be small just to be safe or to be accepted. I don't think it's the Lord's will for us to swallow ourselves whole to meet other people's expectations of us. Again, with like the core values and the practices, we always want to check what we're doing with, does this align with the heart of God? Does this align with who God reveals himself to be through the scriptures? But somehow we've decided that we're not allowed to be human. And so one of the things I tend to get on a soapbox and, rail against if I can get anybody to listen is how we have got to get back to integrating our theology with our humanity. And you touch on this in the book. And I got very excited when I got to that part. We are to deny our flesh, right? So these are the things that don't align with the heart of God, but we are not to deny our humanity. I think it's ironic that we kind of force people to do that, women, especially when we have an incarnational God that put on skin so that he could come and be near. And so when people are thinking, when they're hearing me say, or hearing you or anybody else say, hey, let's get back in our bodies. Let's actually honor our emotions to a certain degree. Let's be curious about our desires. If people are going to have the same reaction I had when someone first had that discussion with me, how can we help people see that this is not some new age woo-woo thing, but this is a holy, sacred, like holistic type of faith that we're hoping for instead of like some new age kumbaya situation?
Well, scripture talks about if you want to see the Father, look at the Son. And when you look at the life of Jesus, he was deeply human. Just he lived in a body with people and ate food and slept and cried and got angry, but in a holy way somehow. And he did all the things, right, that people do. And by the way, he didn't have this like really clear agenda for every day. It was like he responded to the other human bodies around him when they had need or longing. And then sometimes he walked away from need, which is another whole quandary that we can get ourselves in. He left rooms a lot when it maybe seemed like he should have stayed. And so I think this idea that we're not allowed to be is one that's deeply embedded in us. And I don't know that we can ever point to a time when we learned it. It's just kind of in the water. But if someone is kind of already starting to turn the podcast down because they're like, these two ladies, we can't be doing this.
Do.
But I think it can be helpful, maybe it's helpful to think about, when we say, what if you could trust yourself? What if your emotions are allowed in the room? What if that's important information for you to have? I think if we could say that, and I'll kind of put this caveat to it, I'm not saying trust your emotions to the exclusion of everything else.
Right.
I'm not saying trust yourself above all else and only yourself to the exclusion of everyone else. But what if you could trust yourself too? What if you also got to have a voice at the table along with trusted advisors, along with the Spirit of God within you, along with the faith you brought home to yourself from childhood, the things that you're holding dear? There are so many voices. And I don't mean that to say like there's too many, but the fact that we also, our deep desire and what we long for also can have a say. That's not to say we're always right. And I think we have this obsession with like, there's one right way, there's one right answer, and our job is to discover it, or that we see God, an image of God comes in here, right? Because we see God as this like divine, almost like a trickster who has God's will in one hand and like everything else that's terrible in the other hand. And he puts them behind his back and we're supposed to like guess. And hopefully we pick the right way if we're like doing all the right God things, but maybe we don't. And then what happens? And I just don't see, I used to, but I just don't see God that way anymore. I think God most often in most of our decisions and things that we do in our life is standing with us with both arms open, hands open wide, and saying, what would you like to do next? And I believe God is intuitive enough, strong enough, loving enough to let us know if we start to make a turn and it's going to lead to some type of destruction. We can trust God in ourselves enough to trust that. And even if we do make mistakes, which we will, we can trust that, guess what? We have a God who goes with us, who says that goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our lives. The image that I get there is the actual connotation there in Psalm 23 that says goodness and mercy will follow us. It's actually a chase after us. Goodness and mercy are chasing after us as we walk with God, the Good Shepherd. And so it just takes the pressure off a little bit. And I think we can begin to develop our own liturgy of lightheartedness, what I like to call it, of like, wow, what if it's not all actually up to me to figure it out? What if God and I together get to move through this life with some wonder and some curiosity, knowing that I'm not going to always get it right, but also remembering that the point isn't getting it right all the time, but it's union with and connection with God and others as we continue to do our next right thing in love.
That's beautiful. And it's really encouraging to me because I am one of the people who has struggled with and am trying to heal from that very like high stakes thinking. If I make one mistake, everything will implode. And if I project the experiences I've had on earth onto God, if I make one mistake, he will leave me. He will abandon me. He will shame me. He will, hate me, whatever. And so learning that the heart of God is never far from us, even at our lowest, and that God is for us. I mean, I know that. I've been teaching that for a really long time, Emily. But I think I'm just now really believing it. Like, he is for me. He is with me. He is within me. And he desires my wholeness. And so if I want him to make me whole, I have to bring my whole self to him. I have to present my whole self, body, mind, spirit, to him, so that he can do that work. And one of the things that I've been trying to explore more is, we're told to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So we're to steward all of those things. Sometimes we tend to focus one-dimensionally on what that might look like, but we really are whole beings. God knew what he was doing when he created us that way and purposefully sent Jesus to embody that same situation. It's okay for us to bring our whole selves before the Lord and have him make us whole. I guess what I want to ask you now, because I confess to my listeners that I am merely learning, like I'm just now practicing spiritual formation practices. So what next right thing would you offer me / them in how to discern what holy shift I might need to make or they might make in life and faith.
It's such a beautiful question. And probably no matter where you are on the spectrum of being someone who has grown up in a tradition where you have felt like you had to work hard for your acceptance, or if you have been swimming in waters of grace for a really long time, I think we would all do well to be reminded that there is a divine well from which you can draw, and that you are seen and held there, and that there's nothing that you can do to make God love you more or less. And for me, when I engage in any practice, whether it's silence and solitude, something more formal like that, and I say formal in the sense of more traditional practice, or if it's an unconventional practice like making dinner or going for a walk, no matter which of those practices I engage, the point is, am I entering into this practice with an awareness that God is with me or not? And if not, then I think it can still be a good practice, but maybe it's not, you wouldn't maybe call it a spiritual practice, although I'm coming to terms with the idea that I just don't separate things out like that really anymore, Christine. Like spiritual practice or just practice or being a person, I think we can be aware, and there is an invitation for us to be aware of God's presence with us in everything we do. And I would like to think that's actually part of what it means to be a Christian, is to recognize, or to be a person, is to recognize God's presence with us in all things and to refuse to separate out. But in that, I think the second thing maybe I'd say is, I think learning to practice kindness toward ourselves, learning what does it look like in this moment where I'm imperfectly practicing? What does it look like to be my own friend and not my own taskmaster? To come alongside my own self with a sense of maybe almost not silliness in a disrespectful way, but in a lighthearted way, that I can notice what I'm doing in the presence of God and do it without judgment and think like I'm not journaling enough, or I'm not doing it the right way, or this isn't eloquent, or I should be, those shoulds that come in, like I should be praying for this long. I mean, these are kind of like, these are like old covenant things. This is like old life things, but we're invited into a new life way of things. And I think it's where burden is light and the movement is easy.
Thank you, Emily. That's beautiful. I so appreciate you, and I so appreciate your work, and I so appreciate your gentleness and your kindness as people come to you, and with these big, terrifying, problems and decisions that need to be made. And you, with your voice and with your work and with your wisdom, just help us all take a deep breath and exhale and kind of get still and be curious and think about, like, who is God and how near is he, which is just, to me, the only thing that brings me peace is his nearness and his presence. You ended your last book with a blessing that I thought was just beautiful. And I wonder if you would read that to us kind of as a prayer as we end our time together today.
Sure, I would love to. Well, this blessing borrows some language from our Quaker friends, where they pray in a way by saying, I'll hold you in the light. As you consider the rooms you're in, the rooms you've left, and the rooms you're ready to enter, I will hold you in the light. As you evaluate the rooms of your life, as you point to what's true, call it out loud, and consider if it's time to go, I will hold you in the light. As you carry the questions those rooms raise in and around you, to apply or not to apply, to accept or decline, to keep trying or to let go, to speak up or to stay quiet, to move on or to dig in, I will hold you in the light. As you stand in the hallways that seem to have no end, wondering if you have a place to belong, questioning your next right thing, healing from the pain and confusion of goodbyes, I will hold you in the light. As you approach new thresholds of possibility, heart full of hope, head full of curiosity, body pulsing with new energy, I will hold you in the light. As you navigate all the rooms of your life as the person who you are and are becoming, I will hold you in the light. I will hold you in the light of God who parents us, Christ who befriends us, and Spirit who is our divine comfort. In your arrivals and your departures, may peace be your kind companion, embodying your rooms, following you out, and traveling with you wherever you go. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Emily. Hey, thank you for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I just love Emily. She's always stretching me and growing me in the best way possible. And if you want more information on her, want to know how to connect with her, maybe want links out to her books, we've got all of that in the show notes for you. Just go to theholyshift.org to access those, or you can just click on the link below. And then while you're over there, I would love for you to subscribe to our newsletter so that you can get notified when we've got other shows coming up and just be part of our community. And then we've also got some other resources over there for you. We've got the free downloadable workbook for the Draw Near, Dwell Well series. We also have some course options, some group cohort options, and even an opportunity for one-on-one spiritual mentoring if you'd like that. So go over there and check that out. And then, of course, if you're liking the show, make sure and subscribe. It really does help other people find us. Thanks again for joining me as I learn how to draw near and dwell well and explore the upside-down kingdom of God as the right way forward.